Hi guys, it's Lucy. This week I wanted to do a more in-depth video on the warmth of other suns along with some other related recommendations. So last week I read half of this book and really felt that it deserved to be read by everyone, that it was highly educational. And this week I finished that up and I jotted down a few points that I wanted to share. And it is by no means comprehensive of all the things I gleaned from this book, but they are, to me, I found interesting that I thought would be cool to share. So the first point being the existence of Jim Crow laws. So we all know, at least I learned in history books, that slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln. This was back in 1863. But in my history class, I did not learn that Jim Crow laws were actually legalized. So this was, I admit, like something that I should have learned way back when, but literally just learned in 2022 February. So Jim Crow, the term itself is not actually that serious. So I looked it up and it seems to have come from a show called Jim Crow, and this was actually a caricature of Black people, and it was performed by a white actor, Thomas D. Rice. So that's the most common attribution that I found, and it could very well be true, but these laws essentially legalize segregation in certain states in the South. And when you think about it being a legalized thing, not just a term thrown around by, people experiencing it as part of the unspoken of culture, but when actually everyone is free, I thought it had meant that, but this is actually legalized. So some of these stories in this book, it reminded me of musical chairs. So the fact that if you're a migrant, or if you're visiting relatives in the South, traveling north, south, whichever way, you would pass by border towns, and these border towns act as the separation, the defining geographic place between the free North and the segregated South governed by the Jim Crow laws, where, Black and white people cannot play checkers together, they cannot be married to each other, they cannot even be seen as potentially being together as a couple. Like, these are things that people still got lynched for after they were pronounced as free people, federally speaking, but not at a state level. It's ridiculous, right? So this was quite interesting. So if you're traveling on a train, you could sit anywhere before the border town, like in the free parts, so north of Washington, west of El Paso. And then I think for the middle states, it's the Ohio River being the defining point, roughly. But when the train crosses into the south or east of El Paso, you literally have to get up as a Black person and move to the parts of the car or the specific train cars that are designated for Black people. And this is just really odd that you would have to do this in a single country. Anyway, so I think it introduces a whole host of issues. Like, we're talking about segregated washrooms, that being a cost that businesses have to bear for, building extra facilities. There would have to be segregated stores. There were segregated schools until I think was it at least after the 1960s. So accounting for the Jim Crow laws, the U.S. was not really free until, from my research at least, or an interview that I watched with Wilkerson, it was 1964, 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So slavery didn't really end until our parents' generation. That's just way too recent based on, what had been an idea of how the U.S. history played out based on my Canadian education. So this story follows three people, and they each of them migrated during a different decade of the wave of migration, where there wasn't exactly a movement, but it's just people just kept moving out. So one person in this book moved out in the 1930s, and another one in the 1940s, and another person following him, he moved out in the 1950s. And it follows their individual stories. And the cool thing is that these people moved to the three main hubs or receiving stations. So the one from 1910s, she moved north, following her sister. I think she landed in Chicago, her sister in Milwaukee. She represented the Midwest kind of central stream of migrants from the South. And then the second person, he was migrating from Florida, and he went up north to New York City. And then another person, the last one, he was migrating out of Alabama, and he ended up going west to Los Angeles. So these were all large receiving stations, and people had settled along the way to these faraway places. And there is a difference in the way that their experiences played out, obviously, because they're different people, but also at different times there were, so for example, with regards to segregated schools, that impacted some of their kids, but not the others. So their experiences differed based on where they went and also the time from which they migrated. So she covers all of that brilliantly in this book, and that's something that I appreciated. That's why I thought it was like the voices of all the people that she interviewed drilled down compactly into one single narrative story. So this is described as a narrative nonfiction, and it fits that category beautifully. So, I mean, another thing that I wanted to mention was a brief mention of something called the Northern Paradox. This is not the main point, just one of the many things that she quoted. And it was written by a sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal. And the Northern Paradox, Myrdal wrote, almost everybody is against discrimination in general, but at the same time, almost everybody practices discrimination in his own personal affairs. That still applies today, but back then, I think Wilkerson goes on to say that is by not allowing blacks into unions or clubhouses, certain jobs, and white neighborhoods, indeed avoiding social interaction overall. So as a migrant, you would think that my people are free to be themselves in the North and free to pursue opportunities that that is owed to everybody who is a citizen of the US. And whilst that is true, when people actually arrived in the North, of course, with basic things like jobs and housing, we know that that is not the case. And the Northern Paradox capture this sentiment, I think, perfectly. And to today, I mean, all the minorities, when we talk about ceilings and discrimination, it is a national paradox, right? It's not just Northern anymore, because we did away with Jim Crow laws in the States, and theoretically, everybody is equal, but the question is, it is sometimes some sort of a paradox, and it's just retreating into something even more undefinable, and that makes it, I think, harder to fight and harder to make progress with, at least in my opinion. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of inferiority or self-enforcing inferiority complex that I read coming across personal stories related to some of these characters. So the first one being orange pickers in Florida. The fact that one of the main characters, or the people followed in the story, try to unionize people and say that, we won't work for this pay, because they understood that the oranges all needed to be picked. This is a lot of profit on the line, and it is a perishable good, and they are the main labor force behind this. And they have all the leverage and arguing power, but it was just really hard to mobilize people and work together to combine themselves as a single group. So when this guy tried to organize people, some of these people went behind his back and told on him and told the orange pickers, the grove owners, that they didn't want to not to accept a higher wage. They wanted to work for the lower wage, but they were not allowed to by this guy. It's ridiculous. It's not ridiculous. You can think of this as people really needing the money to pay for food and all of their daily expenses, which I think at this point, that being nothing, like these people were living at the poverty line, it's on a subsistence level, even when these states supposedly, people are free. But the fact that they can't organize themselves into a union and not backstabbing each other, but in a way pitted against each other, it makes it really hard to rise up as a group. So that was an interesting element, and I know that really hurt one of the characters deeply because he believed more. There was more that his group could do collectively, but it was just really hard to organize. One of the other characters, the one that moved out to Los Angeles in the 50s, is a surgeon, and he mentioned that when he was starting his practice, he thought that him being a black surgeon from the South, he could very easily solicit the businesses of the existing migrants, of which there were many at the time and growing. So he shouldn't have had to worry about a customer base. But especially in the days when he was starting out, he realized that there were people living in Los Angeles who did not want a colored doctor, even though they themselves were colored. For some reason, they demanded to see, they demanded for themselves white doctors, which perhaps to them implied a higher level of service, of knowledge, of esteem, something like that. And it didn't quite make sense. I think it was really hurtful. I could see how that would be hurtful. And again, it's the same idea where the people of the one group are not supporting each other in a way that perhaps some of them even thought they should. So that was an interesting element, and I'm pretty sure that there are other stories that kind of echo that line of self-enforcing or self-enforcing inferiority complex. So I could see that not just for Southern migrants moving out and looking for better lives, but to be honest, all minority groups, immigrant groups as well. So the last thing I wanted to touch on did relate to immigrant groups, and this is related to the Cicero riot. So Cicero, is he Greek? He could be Greek. The Cicero in my mind, the original Cicero is the guy who is very good at speeches. But this Cicero is, I think, maybe named after him, maybe not, but starts with a C. And this is a neighborhood in Chicago. And this neighborhood became famous for rioting in the early 1950s. And the source being that a black family, well-to-do, wanted to move into a white neighborhood, and apparently examples all over, this was quite common. It was very hard for black families to try to find better housing, even though they have all the means to do so and the freedom to do so. The neighborhood lines, and specifically people trying to protect the real estate value of their homes, these lines were drawn so hard and protected so harshly by the residents themselves that the black people had to try to move in the middle of the night so that they don't arouse extra attention, that they could move in properly. There are a lot of instances of bombings and fires, so anything to try to stop these families from moving into predominantly white neighborhoods. And this is really sad, but I think this probably touches home for a lot of families back then, that they were paying some of the highest rents for some of the most dilapidated housing by absentee landlords who are trying to squeeze out the most out of people living on the edge. And it is such a vicious cycle, and this is something that I'm half paraphrasing from the book as well. So it's not just a matter of Black families having a hard time, but it's almost as if, starting from the beginning, the other immigrant families, so Cicero, as an example, is not a dominant white neighborhoods where people are generations and generations back white. These are immigrants, first and generation white immigrants. These are Czechs, Poles, Italians, who are first and second generation immigrants fleeing from fascism and Stalinism, who are more southern than the average Mississippi plantation owner by the way that they are reacting to the Black people trying to move into their neighborhoods. This brings on, of course, like I said, a whole host of other problems. And that really reminded me of a book. So this is my first recommendation. If you are a social justice animal, like I am secretly, and you stayed on this far to listen to me rant about the injustice of it all. So the first recommendation is a book that I came across 3-ish years ago. It's called Evicted, and the author's name is Matthew Desmond. So another Pulitzer Prize winner. This is written just like this one. It's another narrative fiction. Desmond himself is a Princeton sociologist, and he won the MacArthur Genius Grant. And his work follows 8 different families in, I believe it's Milwaukee. Yes, as they struggle to keep a roof over their heads. So it's very easy to follow. He does jump a little bit between the different families, but you really get an idea of what the current day situation is like. A lot of this has to do with race and racism indirectly, as these evictions, these problems of just continuously vicious cycles of poverty and homelessness and just deteriorating neighborhoods in terms of security and stability for the kids. All of this is covered here. So it's almost like what happened in the most part of 20th century has flowed down somehow to their kids and their grandkids in the 21st century. So this describes the situation today, I believe, and only worsening from that point. So this is a nonfiction work that I recommend in relation to the warmth of other suns. And then going the other way, I would recommend, and this is for people who like fiction works, the Book of Negroes. And excuse the N word, but it is part of the title, and it's being used as a noun, not in a derogative way explicitly, but I think it's a very front-facing, just like the cover. It is what it is type of thing. So it's written by Lawrence Hill. He is a Canadian author, and this book won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best Overall Book. So this is one of those books that were quite heavily promoted, I think, back in 2000 or 2006 era, but these days you don't really see this on the shelves. So this is what I mean by browse extensively, the back shelves. Yeah, so this is published in 2007. This is extremely well written. It follows a girl in Africa. Fictional work. Fiction, this is completely made up. There's no reference whatsoever to any sort of true story. But I think this is one of those fictions that do speak the voice of truth in a made up way, if that makes sense. So this was set in late 1700s, and it follows her as she becomes enslaved and journeys, and her later life as an enslaved woman in the United States South. So it ends off around the mid or early 1800s, and timeline-wise, being the first generation of slaves in North America, they would be the grandparents of the people who were migrating and making their way to the rest of the country in Isabel Wilkerson's book. So that's all of my recommendations book-wise. I did do a little bit of research on YouTube because Isabel Wilkerson did a lot of recorded interviews in promotion for her second book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents, and I watched some of them, and I'm very, very interested in reading it. So I might not even wait until next February for Black History Month. I think I might pick it up this year. So I will link her original TED Talk on the warmth of other suns, which was really well done. I think if you have time, if you're doing some chores or washing dishes, this is a really good listen. There's also another interview with her and the rabbi, I think for the New York synagogue, one of the associations in New York. So this is an Asian woman. So anyway, so they had a very interesting conversation around race and racism, and I was interested in this rabbi's viral talk as well on the same topic. So they're not exactly drawing direct comparisons with the sufferings of the slaves and their descendants versus the Holocaust and the Jewish survivors from the 30s, but there is some overlap in the way that segregation is approached. So the direct line being that in the 30s, Hitler and his cohort were actively trying to learn from the segregation laws, the Jim Crow laws that were set up in the States. So the States being a leader in legalized segregation, that there is no other way to describe that in a more political accurate way. But it is a very interesting talk, so I will link those if anyone is interested. I hope you all have a good reading week ahead, and let me know what you think about my recommendations, and if you've read any of them. I'm always interested to hear what you guys are approaching and reading as well. Have a good one.